Hello, and welcome to the pre-concert talk for the Bard Summer Music Festival's 2021 program, Nadia Boulanger and Her World. I'm Eric Lubarsky, I'm a musicologist, and tonight we're going to be talking about Program 5 from the series, Teachers, Mentors, and Friends of the Boulanger Sisters. The program tonight consists of 4 composers, 2 who we can understand as traditionalists, Paul Dukas and Charles-Marie Widor, and 2 who are younger composers and really aligned in the sort of modernist idiom, Nadia's sister Lily Boulanger and Frances Poulenc. And while it's easy to understand these composers as the dueling sides of the early 20th century between tradition and modernity, I'd like to take a moment to consider the context of this moment in time and use that to try to help us understand and appreciate some of the reasons that these groups of composers arrived at their different style tastes and choices at this moment. So at the turn of the 20th century, people had a real historical awareness for themselves. They started to really understand themselves as being modern in some way. And broadly speaking, when we speak about the history of art and music, we think a lot in terms of innovation and progressive style changes. And so it's easy to believe and to think that everyone was really in favor of change, of newness, and of these modern styles and modern aesthetics. But the actual situation was a lot more complicated. While everyone kind of agreed that we were modern in some way, that people lived in this new modern life, not everyone really agreed that this was a good idea, or that modernity itself was always a sign of positive progress. In fact, this becomes really more characteristic to understand the central tension between modernity and tradition as being this driving dialectic of the moment, this constant debate that people wrestled with individually and collectively. Now, not everyone really knew it at the time. It was more of a kind of lived experience, an intuitive sense of themselves. But what people were really contemplating and pondering around this concept of modernity is what historians today now refer to as the Second Industrial Revolution. What that was basically throughout the 19th century, across what is now called the developed world, we saw economies rapidly shift from largely being agricultural and people working on farms into doing factory work and greater industrialization. Now, this changed not only the economy, it changed labor structures, obviously, and how people did their jobs. It changed social structures because now, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the richest men in the world were these elite industrialists who were now participating in social registers that had formerly only been really by members of nobility, by members of the royal family and their royal families across Europe and their families in various ways. So a lot of social structures had changed. And in fact, quite a lot about everyday life had changed as well, because now we have seen the advent of mass production. We have seen people being able to go out and get all kinds of new products on the market very easily, very quickly. And that changed how people's everyday lives were experiencing them, basically. And so this idea of being modern was very much true in the sense that a lot had changed in the course of the 19th century. Exactly why that changed and where it came about, people weren't entirely sure. Now, there was a very healthy dose at the turn of the century of people who were very skeptical of modernity and modernism, and specifically understood it as being tied to this new industrialization. And perhaps the most famous example of this would be, in the United States at least, although we have examples across Europe, in the writings of the author Upton Sinclair, who you may well know one of his most famous novels is The Jungle, in which he depicts the labor conditions of working in a meatpacking industry and the factories. And he shows it to be really a gruesome scene. He shows it to be really incredibly mechanized. The labor conditions were not great for people. And so this is what, in some sense, what historians today have started to call anti-modernism, which was a trend at the turn of the century in which people were really questioning how modernity and largely industrialization, but not strictly that, had changed their lives. And anti-modernism shows up in a lot of different ways, because it's not exactly anti in the sense of truly being oppositional. It's really more of a skepticism about modern life and the modern world. And essentially people weren't entirely sure what to make of this. Yes, we had new products. Yes, we had a lot of innovation. Yes, there was social change and greater opportunity. But what were we losing? What were the traditions that were disappearing? What kind of world was going away? And these kind of themes show up in really inconspicuous places that you may never have even noticed or thought about. So if we look for a moment at the painting, The Boat Party Luncheon by Renoir, I'm sure many of us have seen this painting before. And one of the things that always strikes me about it is the way in which the two men in the foreground are wearing essentially the same outfit. They have this sleeveless sort of tank top, I suppose, and then they're both also wearing these straw hats. And the more you start looking at the paintings of Renoir, you'll find, in fact, that a lot of men are wearing these straw hats constantly, and you'll find more and more people that are dressing alike. What he was sort of observing here is one of these ways in which industrialization had shifted modern life, in that the shirt that they're both wearing is something that we would now describe as being bought off the rack. And that was an entirely new idea starting as early around the 1880s and in the 1890s, in which mass production allowed for the creation of products like a shirt to be bought and sold, and that people would have the same basic item of clothing. And as a result, that we start to see basically what we call today like trends or trendiness, and understand that they are related, for better or for worse, to changes in the economic structures. Now, whether or not this was a good thing or a bad thing was very much an open question. But what Renoir is doing in this painting is trying to kind of observe this and bring something of this new reality in this new world to light. How you take that was up to you. Keeping in mind this anti-modernist context, I'd like to now take us and start talking about the two teachers on tonight's program, Paul Dukas and Charles-Marie Widor. Both composers were very much self-consciously traditional in their works. By this point in time, in France especially, Wagner and his influence was everywhere. So we saw music with extreme chromaticism and extremely long and loud and just a lot. And what historians have started to now actually describe this moment as maximalist, in the sense of everything was bigger and more is better. Now, when we then listen to the music of Paul Dukas and Charles-Marie Widor, some of the things that should immediately stand out to us are how they are not Wagnerian, how little they use extreme forms of chromaticism. Their tonal language is very traditional in its way. It really harkens back to the early Romantics, the kind of generation right after Beethoven, of Schubert and Mendelssohn, even. And so this was very much a self-conscious stylistic decision for both of these composers. When you listen to the Symphony by Dukas, you'll notice the first movement especially, it has very simple themes that are in formal structures. It's very discernible, it's very listenable, and it kind of feels familiar in so many ways to anyone who is sort of immersed in the 19th century school of symphonic writing. And when you listen to Widor, you get something else that is also sounds largely familiar. To me, the first movement of his work especially really resembles, I would say, the kind of vim and vigor of Beethoven's middle period. It's full of like heroic tropes and excitement and drama, but it does not have this post-Wagnerian chromaticism in any sort of way. And both of these composers were very much attached to major French institutions of the time, the Conservatoire, things like the jury for the Prix de Rome. And so they, in many ways, would represent the institution in their style and in their approach. And this meant being very firmly entrenched and attached to tradition itself. Widor himself actually was an organist, and his own teacher in Belgium understood himself as being directly connected to a lineage of teachers and students that go all the way back to Bach. And so this idea that you have these handed down traditions, especially interpretive traditions, and that they had a lot of weight and authority, and they were really important and mattered, was a very strong and prominent value of the time. And yet, what else was happening was, again, going back to this question of what was this modern world all about, that there was a real sense that these traditions were not just, it's not that they were important, but they were actually being lost, that in the march of progress, things were being pushed aside and dismissed that were still really valuable and should be preserved. And that's really what the institutions of the Conservatoire are all about. Now, that said, neither Dukas nor Widor are some kind of antiquarian or historical composers at all. They were very much aware of the modern trends, the styles of the time, and both of them had moments and manners of introducing the modern life and the modern style into their music. For Widor, really, he was a great advocate of his instrument itself, of the organ. And the work you'll hear tonight he describes it as a symphony. And it's in its own way really kind of quietly radical, because what he's specifically doing is he's rejecting the concerto tradition and very much rejecting probably one of the most prominent trends of the late 19th century, which is the virtuoso tradition of pianists and violinists especially. That you go to hear these soloists give these amazing virtuosic performances. They are flourishing and exciting and dramatic and just kind of spectacular. And that is not at all what you're going to get when you listen to Widor's work. What he is trying to do is to really integrate and, in some sense, normalize the organ as a member of the orchestra. That is what he's hoping to do with his music. And when you have even these moments of the organ soloist, they are almost never flashy in any sort of way. They're very much a juxtaposition, especially in the first movement, between, like I was saying, the kind of heroic style of the orchestra, and then you get these moments that partially just by virtue of being on an organ, they sound chorale-like, and they're much more reminiscent of something sort of solemn and quiet and church-like. Now, for the Symphony of Paul Dukas, like I said, the first movement is very much in a traditional vein. It's very much a symphony that could have been written almost 50 years earlier than it was. But in the second movement, we really start to see him looking forward, and we start to see him using the idioms that were becoming more common, especially among Debussy, and you can see that this is, in fact, the teacher of Ravel as well. Because in the second movement, what we get is what are sometimes described today as timbre modulations. And that's a complicated term, but really what it means is that the composer, Dukas, had a very careful and very sophisticated dovetail effect of entrances and exits exits of instrumental families, so that the melodic idea, the melody, continues seamlessly. But what ends up happening as you're listening is that the tone color changes because the orchestration has changed. And so he does this in a way that, like I said, through the dovetailing of the entrances and exits. This is a really common technique that Debussy himself would really kind of use and exploit a lot, and it becomes very characteristic of what is now sometimes called Impressionism. What you also get with this second movement by Dukas is the melody itself, the thematic idea, is less in the foreground in some ways. The melody is quite slow. It's a very almost lugubrious theme. And what happens is instead it kind of comes in and out of the foreground. And where our ears are drawn into are these moments of sort of baubles and little interjections and ornamentation that are meant to kind of decorate this melody as other instruments come in and out of the picture. And so while overall, when you listen to Dukas' symphony, it's very easy to see this as connected to the early Romantic traditions, as really trying to reject especially the late Wagnerian and post-Wagnerian world of high chromaticism. Dukas himself was still very much forward-looking, especially in this second movement, and really writing in this modernist idiom. Let's take a listen. So if Dukas and Widor represent self-conscious traditionalism at the turn of the 20th century, the other two composers on this evening's program, Francis Poulenc and Lili Boulanger, represent very much the modernist style of the beginning of the 20th century. Both of them come onto the scene and are known as these sort of young composers who are doing something new with their music. However, when you actually look at the pieces, we once again see this kind of question and skepticism around modernity itself. So even though their music sounds new in many ways, that doesn't mean they were just simply embracing this concept of progress with open arms, let's say. And one of the ways this really plays out is in the music of Lili, where we start to see in both of the pieces on tonight's program these references to spring and these references to nature and the natural world. And at the very beginning of the 20th century, in France especially, we get this new art style that I know you're familiar with called the Art Nouveau. And one of the themes of the Art Nouveau, one of the recurring images that you'll find in it, is this idea of this woman of nature. And now I know if you've seen this, but let's take a look at an example here by the designer Alphonse Mucha, who is really considered the first designer of Art Nouveau. And what we can see here is this woman who is she's largely objectified in a certain sense. She is flattened and she is really idealized. But she also is this kind of almost like a goddess figure in some sense. She is clearly attached to nature and at one with the natural world. And her beauty and the beauty of the natural world are basically completely integrated and one and the same. And it's this image of this natural woman who becomes this sort of metaphor for men, but male artists especially, but becomes this metaphor for renewal and rebirth and this source of sort of energy and vitality for a lot of male artists. And when you listen or when you read the texts of the song cycle by Lily Boulanger with the poems by Francis Jammes, you see this same kind of woman making an appearance. The poems themselves are this story and this narrative of a male poet, the speaker, who is reminiscing about his absent beloved, but she is always this woman who is completely immersed and attached to nature in all of these ways. And throughout the poems, there are all of these floral images and these connections to nature. And she herself, the woman and nature, both become this point of refreshment and revival and vitality for the speaker as he remembers his lost beloved. And we get some sense of this metaphor of spring and vitality and life in Boulanger's work, Morning in Spring, in which, to me, the work is not strictly, does not depict anything specific in a very literal sense, but when I listen, what I get out of it is this sense of busyness of a spring morning. I feel like there's almost like bees buzzing and the wind is blowing and causing flowers and leaves to shake everywhere, and maybe there are some animals scurrying about. And so you get this sort of vitality of spring, and it's energetic and it's kind of refreshing to listen to. Yet part of what this metaphor was, especially coming back to these questions of modernity, was that this new thing that was being born, this rebirth coming about in this moment of spring and this modern style of young people, it wasn't always... It was beautiful, but it wasn't always refined. It was sort of, it could have these moments that were rough or dissonant, or if we think about, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, especially, this Spring's Awakening could be quite violent in some sense, really radical. And so even with Lily's work, Spring Morning, you hear the sort of melody at the beginning is sort of jagged. She uses these dotted rhythms that feel very almost rough around the edges. And it's the same sort of idea where it's lovely and refreshing and really interesting and new, but you're not entirely sure that it's beautiful. It needs some refinement, and it needs to almost ripen and mature still a little bit. It's very immature in a certain sense. And that was this metaphor of spring. Now, in the song cycle, we also see Lily really attaching herself to the traditions of her teacher, specifically Gabriel Fauré. And we can see her here using Fauré's very specific ideas and aesthetics around how to set a French text. With the Mélodie, he advocated a set of rules and guidelines for setting a French text in a way that was natural to the language. And in really simple terms, basically, he believed that the French language had long syllables and short syllables, and that a melody, you should not set a short syllable to a long note in a melody, in some sense. It's obviously more complicated than that, but that's basically what he's trying to get at. And the result is that even if you don't speak French, it's very easy to listen and kind of pick out what's going on and really understand the words, because it is following supposedly the natural rhythms of the language itself. And you can really hear that when you listen to Lily's setting. Now, the last work on the piece, the last work on the program is Francis Poulenc's Concerto for Organ, Strings, and Timpani. And here, this piece is very much a transitional piece for the composer. And he is known, he's part of Le C when he comes out and he's young, and he's known as being kind of one of these young radicals in this new modern style. And yet, his actual values and beliefs were very much in this anti-modernist vein where he was really questioning and skeptical about modernity and modern life. Now, before he composes the Concerto for Organ, he had just composed two other fairly successful popular works, a concerto for two pianos and a harpsichord concerto that he wrote for his friend and harpsichordist Wanda Landowska. Now, Landowska, by this point in her life, she had her career, she started in Paris, but she had really rejected this urban lifestyle of Paris and decided to move to this small village where she could basically live on, it wasn't exactly a farm, but it was a large enough piece of land to have a large garden, and she built a little recital hall, in fact, right in the garden. And she was very much committed to pulling away from urban life and really embracing the rustic locale of her new home in Saint-Louis-la-Forêt, which is this little village. And she starts giving these concerts that she calls countryside concerts. And in fact, that is what becomes the name, or it's a sort of working title, of the concerto that Poulenc wrote for her. And the piece is really about trying to embrace this sort of countryside, rustic, and rural aesthetic. And so this is where his head is sort of at when he starts to come into writing the organ concerto. He suffers this personal tragedy where a close friend of his dies, and it inspires him to take a pilgrimage to a small, a well-known medieval pilgrimage site in southwestern France called Notre-Dame de Rocamadour. And he's thinking about this pilgrimage when he's writing this piece. He hasn't yet taken it, but he describes the piece as, this is Poulenc en route to the cloister. And what that means for him is that the cloister very much represents, I mean, it always has, but it represents for him this rejection of the modern world. That's sort of the point of going into a cloister, of going into a monastery or an abbey, is that you turn your back, you turn away from the modern world and all of its Vanity Fair, and you dedicate yourself to these sort of spiritual matters and these higher causes. And this is what it represents for Poulenc, and this is what is kind of going on in his mind as he's working on this piece, and when he says he is en route to the cloister. And indeed, the cloister is going to continue to represent this for him in his later work, his opera Dialogue of the Carmelites, which really grapples with these same themes. Yet he takes his pilgrimage and he has this great spiritual awakening, but that's not exactly what's going on in the piece you'll hear tonight. The piece you'll hear tonight, he's much more sort of questioning the modern world and becomes very self-consciously Baroque in his writing. He's studying the music of Bach and Buxtehude, and he's trying to write in their kind of style in some way. And what the piece to me almost represents, it's very reminiscent of a Baroque dance suite in which you have all of these individual movements. They're played consecutively without a pause, but you have individual movements, and each one has a very unique and distinct mood and character. And the intrigue of the piece, just as in the dance suites, is in the juxtaposition of these moods and characters. So when you listen tonight, the first movement starts in this dark kind of Gothic tone that really resembles this like medieval contemplative Christian tradition of pondering the sacrifice and the passion of the Christ. And so it's dark and kind of moody. And then the next movement jumps immediately to something light and bright and airy almost. And this ultimately is what comes to characterize Poulenc's writing. He's known as being a very Janus-faced composer, as having these multiple sides to his sort of musical personality, if you will. And that his work kind of touches between these extremes, from darkness and like a kind of bleak despair almost, to real exuberance and joy. And the piece you'll hear tonight, I think, kind of touches on this array of moods and tones in a really beautiful and interesting way. So hopefully you can take some of these ideas we've discussed tonight into your listening experience. And what I hope you might take away from this is, when you listen, it's very easy to listen to the composers on tonight's program and hear them as we have two traditionalists, two composers who are very much attached to the kind of early romantic symphonic world, with Yet they're still making some new changes. They're still interested in the modern world and the modern idioms. Ducas writing at times in things that sound, like early Impressionism, and Widor is trying to expand the orchestra and its range and its instrumentation. And on the flip side of that, you have Boulanger and Poulenc, who sound very new, and they are part of this young school of composers coming out and rejecting the romantic tradition sort of entirely. And yet, for both, they're really united in a lot of skepticism around what this modernity actually means. What is this modern world? Is it good or is it bad, these changes we are experiencing and living through? And what is the role of tradition? And what should we try to maintain and hold on to? What is being lost in this march of progress? With that, I hope you have a wonderful concert experience. My name is once again Eric Lubarsky, and thank you for joining me this evening.